I have accumulated so many books that I've given up all hope of organizing them. My most important book has been translated, I think, into 26 languages.
26 languages.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's very hard to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer. Thank you for letting us do the interview at your home in Chicago.
My pleasure.
So now we have the two least popular presidential candidates in the U.S. history, in a sense. So what does this say about the U.S. politics nowadays?
I think it's quite clear that with regard to both Biden and Trump, the American public did not want either one of them to be running for president. And with regard to Kamala Harris, not only was she a wildly unpopular vice president, but most people, when you ask them, will tell you that she's not terribly well qualified to be president. They're not seen as the kind of heavyweights that you would expect to lead the United States, especially in these complicated times. I think all of this tells you that the American political system is broken, that there's a fundamental problem here.
Why is this happening?
It's very hard to say. The fact is that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction in this country, and that dissatisfaction has manifested itself in the rise of Donald Trump. So what's happened here is that the American political system is not working well for lots of people. So it's not clear whether the American political system, which many people believe, me included, is broken, can be fixed in the foreseeable future.
So how will this election change the fate of Ukraine?
Do you think that Trump can come into the White House and in effect settle the Ukrainian war and improve relations with the Russians, and in particular improve relations with Putin? I actually do not believe that Trump will be able to shut down the Ukraine war. And the principal reason for that is that Putin's demands are not ones that Trump could easily accept. These are two preconditions. One precondition is that Ukraine and the West have to formally agree that the 4 oblasts that Russia has now annexed are now and forever Russian territory. And of course, the same applies to Crimea. Furthermore, the Ukrainians and the Americans, here we're talking about the West, have to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. They have to declare that Ukraine will be a neutral state. Trump's debate with Joe Biden, Trump was explicitly asked whether he would agree to those two preconditions, and he said no. I find it hard to imagine, given how much Russophobia there is in the United States, that he would be able to get away with doing that. Well, the fact is that Ukraine is already losing the war. So events on the battlefield now favor the Russians. And if the war continues, the Russians are likely to conquer even more territory. Ukraine is not going to be decisively defeated. It's going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state. But the fact is it's going to lose a huge slug of territory. And then there will be a frozen conflict. And where that point is in the future is hard to say. But I would argue it's not far off.
Now let's turn to Gaza. How can this upcoming election change the situation, the disastrous, tragic situation in Gaza?
In the United States, we have this powerful lobby. It's called the Israel lobby. It has awesome power over policymakers, especially when it comes to making policy with regard to Israel. To put it more generally, the lobby is more powerful at the elite level. At the public level, it's less influential today than it was. And there is much less enthusiastic support toward Israel and much more enthusiastic support of the Palestinians in the public today than there was back then. So what you have today is something of a disjuncture between the public and the elites on the subject of Israel. Virtually every politician on Capitol Hill knows full well that the lobby will monitor carefully what their position is on Israel. And if they support Israel no matter what, they give Israel unequivocal support, and they need campaign contributions, the lobby will make sure that campaign contributions are funneled to them. And then once they're in office, if they begin to veer away from the policy line that the lobby faces, the lobby will put enormous pressure on them to get back in line and to become pro-Israel in the extreme once again.
And you talk about the foreign policy blob in this country. I covered the White House for 15 years. I can sense there's certain power that push U.S. foreign policy towards some direction, but I can't tell who are they? Like, who are the blob exactly?
Well, I think when people talk about the blob, they're talking about the American foreign policy establishment writ large. You know, we're talking about policymakers, politicians, people in the media, people in think tanks, people in academia. They all believe that we are the indispensable nation. We should be the most powerful state on the planet. They all think that we have a right and a responsibility to roam around the world and interfere in the politics of other countries on topics like Israel, on topics like China, and even on topics like Ukraine. Now, the one exception to this is Donald Trump. He's not interested in running all over the world, interfering in the politics of other countries. It's in the contest between Trump and the blob in his first term in office, who wins? It's perfectly clear that the blob won and that Trump was defeated. Now, Trump, who's fully aware of this, says things are going to be different if I get elected this fall. I learned my lesson. I'm going to bring in people who share my views, and we are going to defeat the blob. We are going to defeat the foreign policy establishment. If I had to bet a lot of money on who's going to win that fight after Trump moves into the White House, and of course we're assuming he wins the election, I would bet my money on the blob, not on Trump.
I covered Joe Biden while he was vice president, and he welcomed China's rise. But while he entered the White House, he totally changes policy to align with the blob's policy on China. How does this happen?
That Biden was tougher on China than Trump was in his 4 years. Why is that the case? And the answer is simply that by 2017, by roughly 2017, China was a great power. And because it was a great power and we had left unipolarity behind, and when that happens, the United States invariably puts its gun sights on that country and goes to great lengths to contain it. It's the mere fact that China has become so powerful that has changed the nature of the relationship between these two countries. It has nothing to do with culture. It's the structure of the system. So one could argue that the conflict or the competition between the United States and China will continue as long as China has a robust economy and as long as the United States has a robust economy. And I see no sign that either economy is slowing down. So I would argue that this competition is likely to continue long after I'm dead and long after you're dead. I wish that were not the case. I think it's tragic that we have this situation, but I do think it was inevitable. And by the way, this is why my book on great power politics is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. This is the tragedy of great power politics.
Is there any essential area that China or U.S. must work with China?
Decision makers on both sides to make sure that it doesn't turn into a war. That is the key point that both sides want to keep. From 1991 up to 2017, this is when the United States is fighting lots of wars. Number one, the United States is a remarkably powerful country, and therefore free to use that power to fight wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That's point number one. Point number two, American foreign policymakers and many people in the American public believe that it is in our interest to run around the world and to turn other countries into liberal democracies, to make other countries look like us. What is the ultimate goal of the color revolutions that the United States has been purveying in Eastern Europe and would like to purvey in Russia? The ultimate goal of those color revolutions is to turn those countries in Eastern Europe and turn Russia into a liberal democracy.
We see many people actually now talking more and more about possibility of civil war. Is there a possibility this will happen?
A very tiny possibility. I think it's more likely that you will have political violence inside the American body politic over the course of the next decade. There is no question, as we talked about earlier, that there is huge dissatisfaction in the American public about the existing political system. People are really unhappy. To put it in slightly different terms, people are angry. Given the tradition of violence in the United States, that anger could turn to violence. But that's different than talking about a civil war. I don't think the differences are that severe that you would have the necessary political incentives to unleash a civil war. So the deep state in the United States monitors what people are doing, and it looks for evidence of political violence, evidence of terrorism, evidence of rebellion, and so forth and so on. And then the deep state has the military capacity to crush political violence and to crush insurrection. So I think that to get a civil war going in the United States would be extraordinarily difficult.